I want to start with an explanation of something about where that's coming from. I'm sure there's a lot more that I don't know, and a lot more that I can tell you in a short vignette. Lag BaOmer is the anniversary of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's death. And the Zohar says that when he died, the room that he was in was filled with light. Okay, so fire produces light, but there's a background to it that's much deeper. When Elijah the prophet was about to leave the world, his principal disciple Elisha, who took over for him, Elisha asked Elijah, I want you to grant me double your spirit. Double your spirit. I don't know, even for a Jew, the chutzpah here is breathtaking, you know. Okay, you were okay, but I want to be double what you were. So Elijah says to him, I'm going to ascend to heaven in a fiery chariot. If you see me ascending, then your request will be granted. The explanation works like this. Person has what he's given in this world, but it's severely limited because of the limitations of this world. When he's leaving this world, when he's crossing to the other side, when the body is losing its grip on his soul, he can receive from the other side things that during his regular lifetime he could not receive. Elijah was telling Elisha, if you fasten your attention upon me, you can get what I have. But at that time, I will have double what I had for the rest of my lifetime. So if you see me then, you'll have double what I have had during my lifetime. Okay, now, the day on which Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai died, he also was crossing from this world to the next. And he also received certain elements of what's called Jewish mysticism that he didn't have at any point in his life. And in fact, there's a passage in the Zohar, or the Zuta, which he communicated on the day that he died, which has in it elements of the Jewish mystical picture of how the world works, which don't exist anywhere else in his writings. So it's not just that, you know, he had to put on sunglasses, like Uncle Joe, in order to make a dramatic appearance in the room where he was dying. It's because a certain element was revealed at that time, which wasn't revealed before. The fires that people light on Lag BaOmer are symbolic of that new illumination that was brought into the world at that time. Now, I'd like to give you a hint of one of the many principles that Jewish mysticism is based on. And by the way, I should tell you, the word mysticism here in semantic terms is a complete misnomer. The word Kabbalah in Hebrew doesn't mean mystical and secret and surprising and shocking and antinomian. The word Kabbalah means received. It's received wisdom, which means it wasn't invented and it's not theorized and hypothesized and invented and creative. It's received wisdom, just like everything else has its roots in the revelation to Moses, and through the book of Ezekiel, which is one of the fundamentals of Jewish mysticism, which was, of course, divinely produced through Ezekiel, so it wasn't his theorizing or hypothesizing, and then God works not only through prophecy, but through lower levels of divine communication. Ruach HaKodesh, and Shimon Bar Yochai certainly possessed that, along with many others. So when you hear the word Kabbalah, don't associate it with the English concept of mysticism. It's received wisdom about God and the world. Number two, some people have the misimpression that Shimon Bar Yochai authored the Zohar. That's also not true. Shimon Bar Yochai had a yeshiva, and there were discussions in the yeshiva, not only among the members of the yeshiva, but there were visitors who came some of whom are named and some who are unnamed. There was a mysterious child who came and gave declamations on all sorts of subjects. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai assigned one of his students, Rabbi Abba, to edit those discussions. So that the Zohar has a structure quite similar to that of the Talmud. The Talmud is basically edited discussions among the sages post the publication of the Mishnah, where they discussed the Mishnah and the other materials that were excluded from the Mishnah and related materials. So here too, it's really, most of it is a list of conversations between these various scholars. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is the chief purveyor of this information, but there are others who make appearances and give declamations, and it's a combination of those sources. Now, just to give you a little hint on how this material works, I want to take a look at the very first verse in the Torah. This is in the art school, I think on page 3, if I remember correctly. Yes, it's on page 3 or page 2 if you read the Hebrew. And I want to preface it by pointing out that this book that's in your hands, this book is a repository of information. It's an instrument of communication, and it communicates simultaneously in many different ways, many different levels. And each level has its own methodology. So whether you speak about Pardes, Pshat, Ramesh, Drush, and Sod, or whether you speak about the 70 faces that the Torah has, you have to understand that these are multiple simultaneous communications. They aren't alternatives and not competing, and there isn't different sects that promote one over the other. That's New York Times talk. There are multiple ways in which the text communicates. Now, like with any text, the author and or the social setting for the text determines the kind of information that it conveys. If someone will take Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet and read it and say, this book is full of lies. Certainly not true that Romeo and Juliet spoke those words to one another and went from this building to that building and then enter stage left and exit stage right and so on and so on. None of that happened. What you'll be told is, of course it didn't. That's not what the book is about. The book isn't history. The book is using a certain incident, which may in fact be fictitious altogether, to explain something about human psychology, human character, social relations, family relations, something about human life. It's not a history book, not designed to do. Somebody says, Encyclopedia Britannica is so boring. Boring, nothing happens, no excitement, no conflict, no clash. Yeah, because it's history or it's information, just supposed to represent information. So if you want to evaluate a book or assess the worth of a book, the first question you have to ask is, what is its purpose in communication? What is it trying to do? Edgar Allan Poe's famous poem, The Bells. He must write the word bells there 100 times. What a waste of ink! Was he paid letter by letter that he wrote such a stupid poem? No, if you have a person who reads it well, by the time he finishes reading it, you could hear the bells ringing. It has a kind of semi-hypnotic effect, and that's what he wrote it for. So, question then is, what are the dimensions of communication of this book? Now, the answer is there are many. And the particular thing that I want to stress to you is, there's one of them which in many circles is given prominence, as if it's the real communication and everything else is fluff. And that's called Pshat. There's a whole discussion of what Pshat means, and it's very deep, but you could, for our purposes, call it the logical, literal meaning of the text. Take out a dictionary, study Hebrew grammar, compare this text with other texts, and do your best to figure out a logical understanding on the basis of those pieces of information. And the attitude of these people is, that's what the book really says. That's what it really says. And anything else about symbolism and philosophical principle, everything else, was made up for entertainment or for self-aggrandizement and had nothing to do with what the real text really says. That's just prejudice. Indeed, according to the Talmud, we have to be told that the Pshat communicates at all. Because it could be that the Pshat doesn't communicate at all. And it's only the other dimensions. You have to know what the author of the text intended should be done with the text. The author of the text, with a capital A, revealed to us various dimensions in which the text is meant to communicate. As a matter of fact, Pshat is one of them. But it's not superior to any of the others at all. And in fact, the Talmud tells us that certain great sages were not specialists in Pshat because they were doing other things that they thought were more important. So one has to outgrow that feeling that the way that a Chinese 11-year-old who was interested and bright and consistent could figure it out, it's got to be the only real meaning the text has, and all the rest is somehow illegitimate. That's certainly not true. Okay, having said all of that, let's take a look at the first verse. Bereshis bara Elohim es hashamayim v'es haaretz. One pshat, or close to the pshat, explanation is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That means the verse tells you when it happened. If you read Rashi's translation, which the art school here uses, it's not in the beginning he created, but in the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, and then the first thing that happens is the introduction of light in verse 3. But both of them are describing when it happened. That's one level. A second level is drush. The letter beis in Hebrew can connote doing something for a purpose. This is in literal biblical Hebrew. Even though the pshat I'm going to tell, the explanation I'm going to tell you is drush. E'avadcha sheva shanim berocho bitcha ktana. Jacob says to his uncle Lavan, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. In other words, I'll work for you 7 years, and in return, you'll allow me to marry her. The 4 there is a base. E'avadcha sheva shanim berocho bitcha ktana. So the base can mean for the sake of. Aha, says the drush. Then the verse would read, for the sake of Rashis, God created the heavens and the earth. Oh, but what is Rashis? Well, there are 2 verses, one in the book of Jeremiah, one in the book of Proverbs, where Rashis is linked to the Jewish people, and Rashis is linked to the Torah. And what it's telling us is, God created the heavens and the earth for the sake of the Jewish people and for the sake of the Torah. So now, the pshat is telling you when, and the drush is telling you for what purpose. And the Zohar has a third message. And they're all consistent. They all supplement one another. The base is another meaning in literal Hebrew. The base is an indication of doing something with a tool. Maimonides actually does it that way, but I'm not using him today. You do something with a tool. Vayachpor bedeker means he dug with a shovel. So the Zohar, the introduction of the Zohar says like this. Rashis is some kind of element which an unmentioned subject used, something or other used Rashis to create Elohim. Glad you're sitting down. Got your seatbelts fastened. What? Elohim? Isn't that a name for God? Hey. And when they had the Targum Hashivim, the 70 who got together, didn't they change the order because they were afraid that they would say that Bereshis created Elohim? So they said they turned it around and put Elohim first and Bereshis second. Didn't they do that? What? Some unnamed element, some unnamed agent used an element called Rashis to create Elohim? What could that possibly mean? Here you have a symptom of a principle which is in common to the Kabbalistic tradition and to the philosophical tradition. And here again, I can't resist putting in a parenthesis. There's a whole pseudo-scholarship that there's a war between 2 branches of Judaism, the mystical side and the philosophical side. The philosophical side is rationalistic, and the mystical side is anti-rationalistic, and there's a whole war and schism and sects and so on and so on. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the truth. This principle, I'm going to explain to you now, is explicitly in the Guide of the Perplexed by Maimonides, part 1, chapter 54, and it is rife throughout the Kabbalistic works. And the principle is, we do not understand the ultimate source of the universe at all. We do not understand the ultimate source of the universe at all. So you want to use the word God to the source of the universe, and you have to say we don't understand God at all. There's no understanding of what he is.
So that's a paradoxical statement.
Why?
I mean, if it's beyond knowledge, how can you make a statement that God isn't?
You make a negative statement. You say, we don't understand it. The
From
negation here is large scope, not small scope.
Right.
It's not that I say it is not. I say I am not saying that it is.
But how do you know that?
But you're shifting ground now, right? For a moment ago you said it was paradoxical. Now you want to know how we know it. Well, there are lots of questions that could be asked, right? But the first challenge is not correct.
Well,
All right?
I mean, Maimonides is very, very much aware of this kind of. I mean, one of his commandments is 30 principles is to believe in God, right? He's very much aware of kind of.
That's true, and he wrote that in his commentary in the Mishnah. His commentary in the Mishnah was written for basic Jewish illiterates,
Right.
and he wrote a lot more about that in other places.
Right.
Right? I'm basing myself on what he writes in the guide.
Right.
And by the way, if you take a look at his writings throughout his corpus, it seems quite clear that after death you can understand. Because the barrier to understanding is that the body holds you back. The mind is encumbered in the body and therefore is crippled. But without that, you could understand. It's quite clear that he says that. So it's not a philosophical principle that God, Creator, can't be understood. I know of no such philosophical principle. I know that it's a statement of fact, but not a philosophical principle. The Kabbalists do seem to hold this, and I have done some work in figuring out what they could possibly mean. And I have a theory. Which I worked out together with my wife, that understanding is mediated by language, or at least potentially linguistic, like Nelson Goodman wrote, symbolic as opposed to specifically linguistic. And God is beyond symbolization, because symbolization imposes false limits. So that would bar a creature that works through symbolization for its understanding. Then the question will be, could God have created a creature that didn't use symbolization for his understanding, and therefore could understand God? I know of no reason whatsoever to deny that. So I don't know that there's an ultimate paradox between the Kabbalistic and the philosophical tradition, as by the Rambam. Could be that the Kabbalists say he just didn't, and Maimonides says he did. But that he couldn't, nobody holds. So that's the answer to that question. How we know is an interesting extra question. Okay. I mean, there's explicit verse. Ki lo yirani hodam v'chai. According to Maimonides, Moses asked God for understanding of his essence, and God said, no one can see me and live. That implies that without living, he could see. And since for Maimonides, the world to come is the soul without the body, that's a place where you could see because you're not living anymore. Okay, so that's a little background. Yeah.
So Hashem communicates to us that the beginning was a tool used to create himself being...
No, you're mixing levels. Beginning was on the level of Pshat. Purpose was on the level of Drush. And we're now on a third level. Don't bring the element of the one level into the other level. It's going to be a different explanation altogether.
So what is it on that level?
Okay, I'm coming to that. So now, if we can't understand what God is, what do we understand? And the answer is we understand his principles of his action. He acts, but he doesn't act randomly. He acts on the basis of principles, which, according to the Kabbalists explicitly, and I think the Rambam would agree, he didn't have to, he chose to. He chose to act on the basis of certain principles, and he created our minds in such a way that we can understand those principles. Of course, we know this because he told us, not because we figured it out. He told us through revelation that he's going to operate on the basis of these principles, which we can understand. Now, the rabbinic tradition, reflected in the Talmud, says, with each name of God, there's associated a principle of action. Kabbalistic tradition says, quite right, now, since you can't talk about God, just talk about the principle of action. That's all you can talk about. Which means that the Talmud is really expressing the same idea, but hinting at it gently. Gently, right? So now, all you talk about is the principles of action. So, a Kabbalist, when he looks at a name of God in the scripture, asks, which one? Not which God, with a capital G, but which one of the principles of action is being referred to by the text, because that's all the text can communicate to us. When at the burning bush, the people say to Moses, among 16 objections, they say, when we go down to Egypt, they'll ask us, the God in whose name you're speaking, what is his name? What would I tell them? Maimonides already asked, what kind of question is that? No one would ever ask that question. It's a colossally dumb question. Because what kind of answer could you give? You give an answer that they know, say, oh, so you know it, we know it, it's common knowledge. Give an answer they don't know, they'll say it's not true. Well, what kind of question could that possibly be? Maimonides says he was looking for a proof. The Kabbalistic tradition says what they were looking for was what principle of action is going to be guiding this process of the exodus from Egypt. Here are two candidates where you can begin to see how it might work. One is punishing the Egyptians. The Egyptians were evil, they're being punished. And by destroying their power, we get the benefit of freedom because their power is destroyed as a byproduct. Or no, it's mercy for the Jews who suffered. But if it's mercy for the Jews, it's done for the Jews, then they have to earn it. Wherever they're punishing the Egyptians, they don't have to earn it. So there'll be a practical difference in which principle it is. The truth is it was both of them plus something else, and they were used in Syriatum and also the combination, but that was the idea. Asking what is his name is to ask what principles of action are going to be present in this performance. Okay, so now, let's start with what the introduction of Zohar says here. Elokim. Elokim is a name for the attribute of strict justice. The only name used throughout the first chapter and the first 3 verses of the second chapter in the creation story is Elokim, which means that Elokim is central to the creation. The characteristic of strict justice is central to the creation. But the characteristic of strict justice has a background. It's not something which is the top of the chain of interactions. It's not the leading principle of the chain of interactions. Something used Reshis to create Elokim. What is Reshis? Reshis Chochmah Yiras Hashem. The beginning of wisdom is Yiras Hashem. So Reshis is associated with Chochmah. Something called Chochmah, which isn't really wisdom, something called Chochmah was the tool which was used to create Elokim, which is Bina. Okay? And what is this hidden agent? It's called Keser. So those of you who know the names of the spheros, Keser, Chacham, and Bina, the first 3 spheros. Which means behind the curtain, Keser is running everything, as it always does, because it's the top of the 10 spheros of a world. And that Keser used an element in the world called Chachma, but that element wasn't a direct application of creating the world. The direct application was something that was made using Chokhmah as a means, and that something is Bina, which is strict justice. That's the description of creation that you have in these 3 words. So Pshat tells you when, Drush tells you for what purpose, and the Zohar tells you who's involved, who's acting. There's no contradiction here. All of them contribute to a single, compound, consistent picture. Yeah.
What's Chachma and Bina?
So, let's see how much I can tell you about this. Keser, which in Hebrew means crown, is like the crown on the king's head. The crown is not part of the king. The king is a body from scalp to toes. But the Keser sits on top of him and indicates something about his status, but isn't part of him. So what's given to understand is, so to speak, the king himself. The crown on his head is beyond our purview. We know its very general character, but we know very little in detail about its activities. Now, Chokhmah is a beginning, it has many connotations, but I should this is just a footnote, but you'll hear many different names for roughly the same thing. The question will be, why does one thing have different names? And the answer is, one thing can have different functions, and the functions are related to one another. but they connote their functions in different contexts. So in Tishnik, Keser Chochma Bina, you have Arach Anpin, Abba and Ima. So Arach Anpin corresponds to Keser, corresponds. They're two names of the same thing in different contexts. And Abba is the same name for Chochma, and Ima is the name for Bina, the same thing in different contexts. One's called a Sphira, one's called a Partzuf. There's a structure here. And by the way, the structure is elaborate and detailed and precise, and it has axioms, and it has theorems, and it has corollaries and applications, and with strict logic. There are differences of opinion about certain parts of the system, but with strict logic. I mean, in string theory and in quantum gravity, they disagree about the fundamentals and how they should be applied, but they're hopefully applying strict logic within their systems. So they're logical systems. Yeah. Okay. So now, there's a way in which they play a role in intellectual terms. Chachma, intellectually, is a pre-linguistic grasp. As I hinted before, whether it's pre-symbolic or not is a separate independent question. I was a student of Nelson Goodman. But they're pre-linguistic. There is such a thing as an insight that you have into something, and you don't yet have the ability to put it into words. What's his name?
I just feel it.
Well, it's more than feeling. What's his name? The British quantum mechanic. He was getting off a bus in London, and he saw how the equation for the electron should work. It took him 3 days to write it down. But he knew he had it. How could he know he had it? Because he's had flashes like that before. And every time he's had a flash like that before, he's able to work it out in detail. So he knows from experience. When I have that, in 3 days I'll have it. I'll be able to write it down. So that's the grasp and there's a great deal of our grasp of the world that transcends language. Indeed, ultimately, language, there have to be words that are not translated into language. You can't go on for infinity, translating. There's some things that you grasp directly. There are many things that you understand prior to logic. Great mathematicians reliably prove theorems. How do they do that? Do they have a secret book of rules for proving theorems that's handed down from generation to generation mathematicians? Well, Gödel proved the theorem that there can't be. There can't be any precise set of rules for proofs that prove theorems. But they reliably prove theorems. They think about it, they get an insight, it's got to work like this, and then they work out the details, and it works out. So Bina is where words come in. Bina is based on Bain, which means to distinguish, to categorize.
Crystallize?
No, crystallize is more like synthesis than analysis. Analysis is pulling apart, and crystallization is pulling things together. But a concept by its very definition, a concept is something which has contours. It has borders. There's something it applies to, something it doesn't apply to. Sometimes there are gray areas as well. We work on those. And words carry concepts. So there's a special process of putting into words that which you've grasped prior to words. And our sources tell us those words never fully exhaust the concept. They never fully articulate it. And that's why that non-linguistic concept can stimulate, can inspire many productions in the future. In fact, there's a statement by the Ramban, writes it twice, once in Kedoshim Tiyu and once in Vasisa Yasha Tov B'nei Hashem Elokecha. And he writes the following, and again, it's because you're sitting down. He says, there are rules, there are ways in which you have to interact with other people. It's impossible to write them all down in a book. Now let's see, he writes this in his commentary on the Torah. Last time I checked, the author of the Torah was God, the infinite God. You're telling me he couldn't write it down? So I think the answer is, sure he could, but it would have 3 million entries and you couldn't read it and learn it and use it. We couldn't write it down for us. So says the Ramban, God used a split methodology. He wrote down some rules which are absolute and which are precise, and then he said, in addition to fulfilling all those rules, extend yourself in this direction, elevate yourself in this direction, and add to them to the extent that you can, depending upon your circumstances and so forth and so on. without words, because there can't be words. There can only be examples, and then an understanding that takes you beyond this, and beyond the words. Another example, which I think is very striking.
I'm sorry, just quickly, is that oral Torah in a sense?
I guess that would all be oral Torah, yeah. A very striking example of this is when the rabbis create a rule telling you not to do a biblical rule. There's a legal background for that. The question is what justifies it. So you don't blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah when it comes out on Shabbos. The first day is biblical, the second day is only rabbinic. So it means you lose the biblical mitzvah. The whole people of Israel loses the biblical mitzvah that year. Why? Well, you see, if it comes out on Shabbos, maybe someone will forget that it's Shabbos. He'll take the shofar. He doesn't know how to blow it perfectly. He'll go to an expert and ask the expert, I blow it this way, did I do it right? Have I done the mitzvah correctly? And he'll carry the shofar through a public domain. And that's not allowed to do on Shabbos, right? Because he'll forget. So, because someone might forget, no guarantee that anyone will forget. And if he does it for that reason, he hasn't violated the biblical mitzvah because he did it by accident. He hasn't done it, certainly hasn't done it deliberately, and if he's osik b'mitzvah, may be the least possible infraction of a biblical mitzvah, because of the possibility of the least possible infraction by a tiny minority of Shabbos, you give up shofar for the whole people. Who says so? Where's that calculated? What legal principles does that obey? That obeys legal judgment. After all, there was a Sanhedrin. This had to be discussed and suggested, and then a vote had to be taken. These people weren't doing this for fun over coffee. They were guiding the practice of the Jewish people in serving the Creator of the universe. And the majority felt that this was an appropriate thing to do. So here's an example of judgment and grasp, which isn't, you can't verbalize it. I'm a classical musician. When you hear musicians interpret a piece of music, they say, well, why did you do it that way? Why did you do it that way? Wouldn't it have been better this way? The answer is you, listen to it. Listen to it. There's a musician, Sarah Wang. She, Chang, I think her name is. She plays the Brahms Violin Concerto. The first movement is 23 minutes long. When Yasha Heifetz played it, it's 17 minutes long. It's an entirely different performance. Having listened to Heifetz and others, you listen to her, first thing he says, oh, this is dragging along. It's exquisitely beautiful. Exquisitely beautiful. How did she come to that? How did she, and have the courage to put out such a strikingly original, there aren't words to describe something like that. You listen to it, you hear it. Does it hang together? Does it have a consistent message? Is the message made in a very moving and exquisite way? Do the themes integrate in a way that gives a structure that's beautiful? There's a lot of grasp that we have. I mean, I grew up through the philosophical behaviorist times when they said everything's in words. You know, all thought is in words. If you can't say it, you can't think it. And if you think it, you're making a mistake. Those were the jokes they used to tell. It's a completely insufficient picture of the way the human mind works.
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail this, but thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So now that's Chochmah, and then it's Bina. So Bina, our world is a world of structure. Our world is a world of limitations, of distinctions, of categories. Right. So it's got to come from Bina. It's got to come from Bina. Okay. Now, as Chazal tell us, and Rashi brings it in the second chapter of Genesis, the description of God in the creation process, and some of the creation process repeated there, some of it is supplemented there. No, there aren't two competing stories of Genesis. It's another name is added. Not only added, becomes first. The name is Yud Kei Vav Kei. So now that's a different principle of action. And since it's a different principle of action, it means in the second section of the story, second chapter of the story, you have a different description of the Creator. So how do you understand? How do you reconcile that? So there's a midrash. Midrash says, when God resolved to create the universe, He first thought to create it. He first thought to create it with the principle of strict justice. So the first chapter describes the original resolve. saw that it couldn't stand, saw that it would disintegrate, and therefore associated, shitefimo, associated with the principle of strict justice, also the principle of mercy. So now, first question, does that mean that the first plan was scrapped? No, it wasn't scrapped. It was added to. The attribute of mercy is available and it plays a role, but still there's some impact of the strict principle of justice, which plays a role in the world. After all, when the angels saw Rabbi Akiva dying, and they complained to God, "This is Torah, this is reward," and God says, "Kach olav machshava lefanai." This is what came up on my mind, right? So the Gaon of Vilna says, "Aha!" Chazal used the same statement twice. One in the answer to the angel of the death of Rabbi Akiva, and one in the original creation of the world. That's not an accident. They used it twice. It means that's the attribute of strict justice, which originally I thought to operate on alone, and then I decided, so to speak, to add to it the attribute of mercy, and he's being treated by the original principle. And that's why he's being treated that way. And if you'll tell me, what do you mean? He thought this way, and then he thought that way, and so on and so on. So the answer to that, Ramchal already points out, that statements of time vis-a-vis matters like this is statements of logical precedence. It's not a statement of Ayman al-Khad. How many minutes were there between the first thought and the second one? Wrong question. You'd be like a mathematician who says, here are the axioms, first this follows, and then this follows, and then that follows. Doesn't mean this follows on Monday, and that follows on Tuesday, and that follows on Wednesday. It means this implies this, and from this you can prove that, from that you can prove that. But it has nothing to do with time, it has to do with logical precedence. So here, the top success of the creation would be those parts that could be judged strictly by justice, but that's not enough for the creation. Creation has gradations, and there are parts which are included with a less stringent requirement, which also play a role in maximizing the purpose of the creation. So that's what's going on. And by the way, it's crucial to understand what I told you before here, that the strict justice, which is like in the Zohar, is number 3 on the ladder, right? That it isn't the top, because it's strict justice. When it said God thought to first create the world with strict justice, I'm saying he thought, well, there's Keser and there's Chacham and there's Bina, and I'm going to do it with Bina. You have to have something like that, because otherwise, if he thought to do it with strict justice is the ideal world, and it's not going to work, don't do it. Give it up. Spend eternity in splendid isolation. Why do it at all? That can't be a correct description of the decision process. But once you understand that strict justice is third down on the ladder, if something is going to destroy the whole process through strict justice, then the higher elements of the ladder say, modify strict justice. Strict justice is there just to express us. It doesn't have its own independent claim to fame. That being the case, it can be modified. Well, this is an example of how the structure works, and we're working here with principles of action. We're not going behind that to the agent who is acting, so to speak. Let me say one more thing, because there's something here which I think is not often appreciated. What is an action? What makes an action different from just an accident? Huh?
It's thought out.
Okay, there's a thought behind it. That's right. There's a thought behind it, and there's a will behind it. You say, I'm going to drop the apple. That's my thought, right? Suddenly the door slams, and I'm startled, and the apple falls out of my hands. That's not an action. The fact that I thought about it isn't enough. It's got to be that the thought is related to the will to make it happen, not that it happens for some other reason. Having a thought and it happening is enough to make it out of an action. Now, in addition to there being a thought, there being a will, there has to be a purpose. You imagine asking someone, he does something. You say, why did you do that? And he says, wrong question. Wrong question. You're asking the wrong question. So, really? That's a wrong question? Can't ask why you did it? then that I won't classify as an action. Something happened to you. So if you say there's no purpose, then what you're saying wasn't an action. I had a muscle spasm, right? I fainted, right? Even if the purpose is doing the thing itself, it doesn't have to be something else. Why did you jump? Because I wanted to jump. I felt like jumping and I wanted to jump. That was my purpose in jumping. My purpose was the jump itself. But if you say that asking the purpose is the wrong question, then what you're doing is you're not classifying the event as an action. Okay, now if the tradition tells us that we can know the principles of God's actions, it means we can know some of his purposes. That already is very deep, valuable information. We know what he's after. We know what he wants. We know what he's trying to accomplish. Not the whole picture, not the ultimate purposes, what purposes there are. Now, of course, God revealed all of this to us, so we can be able to operate with it. When God tells Moses that God, is going to destroy the Jewish people after the golden calf and after the spies, and Moses argues, what is Moses doing? Oh, consider this and this and this. How did Moses choose which arguments to make? He's got to believe that these are things that God cares about, and therefore they'll have some relevance to God's decision. And the oral tradition is really quite interesting about this. Moses gives 3 arguments in response to the challenge of the golden calf, and God says, "I will not destroy them because of your arguments." When he also gives 3 arguments, not quite the same, but there are 3 arguments with respect to the spies. God says, "Salach li kidvarecha," and if you're not fooled by the vowels and you take a look at the letters, there's no yud there. So kidvarecha is singular, not plural. The oral tradition says he gave 3 arguments, but God accepted only one of them. The other 2 weren't relevant, from which you learn a lot about God's purposes. That's one of the reasons that these interactions take place. Same with Abraham pleading up a stone. We learn what concerns God is acting for, and then we can mold our actions to conform to those purposes. So when we're told that we have knowledge of God's purposes of action, we're being told quite a lot. Now, if you'll say, Maimonides actually asked this question, you'll say, okay, but then you're not learning anything about him. You're only learning about his principles of action. So he quotes a verse in the book of Exodus. Show me your ways, Moses says to God, show me your ways. That's his principles of action. And the next word in the Hebrew text is ve'edacha, and I will know you. So it says Maimonides, by knowing God's principles of action, you do know him. Only something about him and only one dimension, so and so on, but it isn't as if you're getting a description of his wardrobe. You're getting a description of something about him. And by the way, from the writings of Ramchal, who's a master Kabbalist, this wasn't my field in philosophy, but I don't think we have a good description of the relationship between an agent and an action. Metaphysically, action is something the agent does. An agent, if you don't play one-dimensional metaphysics, so an agent is a thing, it's an object, action is an event. Now you can't simply slice one off from the other because this event was the performance of this agent. Substitute another agent, isn't the same event. On the other hand, the agent and the event aren't identical. In particular, they come from metaphysically different categories. And exactly what is the relationship between them, I don't know how to describe it. Maybe I'm just ignorant of the philosophical tradition. In this area, philosophy of action wasn't my area, but it is a subtle and fascinating thing. So you are getting something about the agent, but not the agent himself. Not the agent himself. This is a fundamental principle that applies throughout the Kabbalah. And at this point, you have 2 different forms, at least 2 different styles of Kabbalistic literature. One is the formal, logical structures that are carried out with great abstraction. There are many, many works that do this in detail. And the other is Kabbalistic insight into ordinary, everyday Jewish topics, whether it's verses that the topics have, or mitzvos that we do. They give you an element of depth that's behind the performances or the verses themselves, which give it more understanding. So I'll give you a couple of examples. This you have specifically in the Hasidic literature. And I should just tell you that this is part of one's service of God in two senses. First of all, if God gave you a capacity, you're supposed to use it for serving Him. He gave you a brain, gave you a mind. So you use it, and although you do use your mind in implementing the Torah, that's true, and it's tricky, and it's difficult, and it's complicated. But if you have a theoretical mind also, the capacity for explanation, then that should be used as well. Maimonides says twice in the Mishnah Torah, his legal work, that everyone is responsible to analyze the reasons for the commandments. It says in Hilchos Me'ila and Hilchos Tmura. So he means you have a responsibility to do the commandments conscious of their reasons to the extent that we can appreciate reasons. So you have certain mitzvos that depend upon right and left. You know that when you wash your hands, you usually use the cup in the left hand, wash the right hand first, then you wash the left hand. When you light the menorah, you light the leftmost candle first, and you light them in order to the right. When you go around the altar, there's a ramp on which you go around, a horizontal ramp, and you always go counterclockwise. You go counterclockwise, facing the mizbeach. When you put on your shoes, put the right shoe on first, and you take the right shoe off last. So it's asymmetrical, right? What's going on? So right is associated with chesed, with loving kindness, and left is associated with gevura, which is din. As I told you, loving kindness is more fundamental than din. Din is an offshoot, so only the third down, right? So you want to express the idea that loving kindness is superior to strict justice. So you wash the right hand first because it's the primary hand. And the left hand comes second. You put on your shoes because if you put the right shoe on first and take it off last, your right foot is more inclusively shod than the left foot. You're giving precedent to the right foot over the left foot. And if you understand how they lived in ancient times, shoes were usually the last thing you bought. Many, many cultures to this day go barefoot. You don't cut yourself. Your skin gets very tough, and you can run vast distances without shoes. That's why you make the blessing that God has provided all my needs on the shoes. Because if you have shoes, then you have everything else. That'd be the last thing that you would get. So here you give preference to the right foot. You make sure that it has more shoe binding than the left foot. When you light the Chanukah lech, you're guided to the right. You're moving from the left to the right. When you walk around the altar, if you're facing the altar and you're walking counterclockwise, then your right hand is leading and your left hand is following. All of these, when a Jew does these things, they just, aha, that's right, that's chesed, that's the prominent principle. This is what's being expressed by principles that are based on right and left. That's one example. As a Gemara in Ksubas, which presents an argument, and if you think about it logically, there's a vast hole in the argument, and the Pri Tzadik, a great Hasidic commentator, fills the hole. And it goes like this. The Gemara there says, if you compare actions, a two-handed action is more significant, more powerful, more representative than a one-handed action. Now, we have a verse that says, God created the heavens with his right hand and the earth with his left hand. So the creation of each item is a one-handed action. By contrast, when we built the tabernacle in the wilderness, the verse says, Mikdash Hashem konenu yadecha, a holy place of God have your hands established, and we built it. So our action is called a two-handed action, and God's actions are called one-handed actions. In this respect, the Talmud concludes that our actions are superior to God's actions. Don't question 1 verses 2, that's an axiom for the proof, right? But there's a big hole. If you paid very careful attention to the words that I said, there weren't so many, maybe 50, you should feel that something went wrong. Let me say it again, and ring the buzzer when it goes wrong. One-handed actions are inferior to two-handed actions. God created the heavens with his right hand alone, the left hand, he created the earth alone. Each are one-handed actions. The tabernacle that was created in the wilderness, we created it. The verse describes it as a holy place, O God, have your hands established. And therefore our action with the tabernacle is described as two-handed, and therefore our action is superior to God's action.
Put that your hands line.
Yeah, what are you talking about? Hey, come on. So we built it, so what? In the verse it talks about God's hands. So well, maybe you don't know what I'm talking about, since we built it, but certainly can't bring a proof from there. It's just a misfire, right? Okay, says the Pri Tzaddik, we have a legal relationship called shlichus. Shlichus means, you know what a shliach is? No, shliach is not a messenger. Doesn't carry messages. He's an agent. He acts on behalf of someone. If I send a shliach to do something, he does it, I get the results of it. If I send a ring with him to a woman, I'm the husband, not he. If I send it to the market to buy a book, when he picks it up, because my book, not his book, he acts on my behalf. Now, says the Pri Tzaddik, every mitzvah that a Jew does, he does as God's shaliach. We are the ones who perform the action, but it's his action that's being performed through us. Now, reread the Gemara in Ksubas a little bit, and then I'll show you how to get the original conclusion out of it. Ask this question. God does lots and lots of things. Some he does on his own, and some he does through our agency. Which of his actions is more significant? The actions he performs alone, or the actions he performs through us? Well, he created the heavens alone, each one-handed, but the building of the tabernacle, which is his action done through us, is a greater divine action, because we say, Konanu Yadecha, your hands have created. Hold on.
Okay.
And now let's come to the original conclusion. Look how great man's actions are, because man's actions confer upon God a greatness of action that he doesn't exercise on his own. That's the greatness of man. Notice my words. I didn't say he couldn't exercise on his own. I said he doesn't exercise on his own, or didn't on this occasion exercise on his own. So when it says that man's actions are greater than God's actions, what it means is man's actions confer upon God an aspect of divine agency which he doesn't exercise on his own. That's using this metaphysical connection of shlichus to explain a Gemara. But without that metaphysical connection, very, very difficult to understand what the Gemara is doing. Therefore, if you're a Talmid Chacham, and you've heard you've heard the phrase shliach mitzvah, and you know a shliach mitzvah has special qualities, right? What is a shliach mitzvah? It's pronounced in the yeshivas as one word, like we're two words. Who's the shliach? Who's the shliach of? And what is a shliach mitzvah? Well, he's somebody, for example, who's collected money and he's on the way to ransom a Jew who's being held captive. On the way, or he's on the way to the Beis Medrash to learn Torah. It's called the shliach mitzvah, and he gets certain immunity. He's immune from certain kinds of dangers, and he's released from other mitzvos. Right? Says the Pri Tzaddik. Now you know what it means. Because he's in the process of doing or going to do a mitzvah, he's God's shliach. And since he's God's shliach, therefore he's immune from some of the dangers, because shluchu shalarim kamoso, their agent who acts for the one who's behind him, takes on some of the characteristics of the one who's behind him. So he takes on some of God's immunity. All this fits together. It fits together under a single description and explanation, if you put in the metaphysical background. So this is one of the things that people with Kabbalistic training do. They use their Kabbalistic background to illuminate the other things which otherwise would be true, all right, and would be correct and valid, but give them a much added dimension of the way in which they operate in the way that God created the world. This is something which Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai brought into existence to the Jewish people. It existed before. I shouldn't say brought into existence. He communicated it by having this yeshiva and having open discussions and having the materials collated and brought together in a sefer. This is the gift that he gave. So when you go to Meron on Tuesday, Mitzvah Hashem, if you get there, ask somebody to teach you something from the Zohar. Ask just a line, just something, so that when you're where he is on his yard site, you learn something in his name. Very good thing to do. Okay, that's an introduction to the outer skin of the infinitely skinned onion. Yeah.
So when we're doing God's will, are we necessarily doing God a favor, or is it ordained on us, so it's a mitzvah? Like, are we voluntarily doing it, or is it?
I know some of the words you say have certain connotations. I don't see quite the direction now. We're certainly doing something that God wants.
Yeah. So it's not our free will; it's God's will.
Well, excuse me. If I tell you to do something, you decide to do it. You're not exercising free will because I told you. You're deciding to obey me.
But I'm doing it because I want to do it for the Rav, not just.
Well, and you do it for God, but still, that doesn't mean you don't have free will. Free will isn't only when you don't want to do it. Free will is characterized by the fact that you could have done otherwise. And you know that you could have done otherwise. Yeah.
First off, that was very happy, thank you. So there was a concept that we've learned a few times, that part of how the Jewish people fulfill the Torah as a whole is we establish our connection to the Jewish people, and thereby I get their mitzvahs in part. So a Kohen, I can never do his mitzvahs, but I have this connection to him. Now Hashem is performing certain actions that have merit, whatever that means, that sustain reality. The same way that he uses me as his shaliach to do certain actions, do I, through my connection to him, get like some kind of connection to the actions that he does to sustain being?
Oh, wow. That's very nice. An interesting parallel structure. I certainly don't know. I don't know the answer to the question. That's a very nice question. A very nice question. You know, there's something called sometimes it's called chaos theory, self-similarity, where the same structure appears on different levels of analysis. And the Kabbalah is full of that. There are certain basic structures, only a few, and they repeat endlessly with different articulations, but they're all what mathematicians call isomorphic. They all have the same structure. So what you're doing here is you're taking a certain structure and you're projecting it onto another field and looking for an isomorphic structure. That's the right thing to do. That's the right question to ask. Just you boldly put this in the divine level. I don't know what to say. But having said this, I'll tell you what a student said to me 25 years ago, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. We are working, one thing we're doing in the world is to elevate the physical. It's a whole story. Okay, so here I am. I'm a soul and a body. The body is physical. My actions and my goals are to elevate my body and to elevate the world around me. So my field of operation is split because one part of it is part of my identity, my own body, and the other part of it is not my own identity. Right? It's the rest of the world, which is external to my identity. So this student asked, is it the same for God? When he created the world and he operates in the world, is it also split? Or is it not? I thought, first of all, what a beautiful question. What a beautiful question. I said to him, I have to think about it. It wouldn't be embarrassing if the answer was no. God is different from us and there are going to be differences. So it wouldn't be, but I'll think about it. And then afterwards it came to me, we have a phraseology in the tradition about the human soul, Chelek Eloka Mima, which literally means a piece of God on high. Now God is not a salami, you can't slice him into pieces. This is poetry. Some people are very happy to have poetry in the Tanakh, God's eyes and ears and shoulders and legs. Okay, that's only poetry, it means that's something else. When it comes to the Zohar and the Talmud, everything's got to be absolutely literal, so that a 6-year-old could read it and understand it without any explanation. Excuse me, the rabbis copied the style of the Tanakh, so the Rambam says, and the Maharal and others say explicitly, so it doesn't have to be taken literally that way. But it means that there's something in the creation which represents godliness in a way that nothing else does. That uniquely represents godliness in a way that nothing else does. So I think the answer to his question is yes. God relates to the soul in a way that he doesn't relate to anything else, because the soul represents him in the world in a way that nothing else represents him in the world. So his area of activity bifurcates also into two areas, the one to which he's more directly related, and one to which he's less directly related. But this is an example of this kind of thinking where you have a structure, look for repetitions of the structure. Now you're talking about the indirect access to the other actions because I'm connected this way to this action. I have to think about it. It could be that you're right. It could be that you're right. I'm not rejecting it. Can you begin to understand why a philosopher would be interested in this?
Yes.
It's not just mumbo jumbo. It's not just, drink some liquor and dance around the campfire and sing songs.